Ladies and gentlemen, old friends and new, it is indeed a pleasure to be with you on this occasion and to be invited to share some of my recollections and thoughts on the memorable event of President Nixon's 1972 visit to China and the Shanghai Communique, during which time I was interpreter at many of the events. To put it into perspective, especially as the Chinese people see it, may I go back a bit in history. On October the 1st, 1949, in the proclamation of the Central People's Government of the People's Republic of China, delivered by Chairman Mao Zedong from the Tiananmen rostrum at the inaugurating ceremony of the People's Republic of China, it was stated that this government is prepared to establish diplomatic relations with any foreign government which is willing to observe the principles of equality, mutual benefit, and mutual respect of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Premier Zhou Enlai, who was then concurrently foreign minister, conveyed this message to the governments of all countries the next day. The Soviet Union was the first to respond positively, followed by countries that came to a total of 23 by the end of 1955. However, the United States did not choose to do so. A witch hunt began within the country to determine who had, what they said, lost China, pointed in no small matter against those China hands who had felt that the new China was not a perfect demon. Besides, no relations, an embargo was imposed, travels forbidden, and despite Chinese warnings that there would be dire consequences, American military forces marched to the Yalu River and bombed the Chinese side of the border. No wonder that there was deep resentment among the Chinese people. Though China was barely out of long years of war, just preparing to lay down arms and start reconstruction of the country, it sent the Chinese people's volunteers to fight a bitter war against the much better equipped armed forces of the United States and its allies, a war that lasted for several years. Later on, the United States threw itself into another war, this time in Vietnam, again on China's doorstep. Meanwhile, the United States had signed a defense treaty with those who had lost the Chinese Civil War and retreated from the Chinese mainland to the Chinese island of Taiwan, and moreover, sent the U.S. Seventh Fleet to patrol the Taiwan Straits. It should not be difficult to imagine Chinese feelings after all this. Then came the early 1970s. President Richard Nixon began the section on China in his first foreign policy report to Congress in February 1970 by saying that the Chinese are a great and vital people who should not remain isolated from the international community. This caught the attention of the Chinese side, who are witnessing the relations between the two superpowers, in particular, the aggressiveness of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the United States in the international arena, and saw that the United States was mired in the war on the Indo-Chinese peninsula and facing a mounting anti-war sentiment at home. The time had come for change. Both sides agreed in the bilateral ambassadorial talks in Warsaw during the first half of 1970 that it would be desirable to have discussions at a higher level and a different venue. In an interview with Time magazine in October that year, President Nixon said that, "If there is anything I want to do before I die, it is to go to China. If I don't, I want my children to." In the latter half of 1970, the Chinese side received quite a number of messages sent by the United States side through the presidents of Pakistan and Romania, respectively. I believe all this prompted Chairman Mao Zedong to say to Edgar Snow, when they met on December the 18th, 1970, he, by whom he meant President Nixon, he was not interested in the Warsaw talks and wished to negotiate with us personally. Therefore, I say, I am ready to hold talks with him if he is willing to come. Edgar Snow wrote a report titled A Conversation with Mao Zedong that was carried in the April 30th, 1971 edition of Life magazine. The same issue included stories and pictures of the U.S. table tennis team's sensational visit to China that was later coined ping pong diplomacy. By now, things were moving fast. It was decided through non-published messages between the two sides that Dr. Henry Kissinger, Assistant for National Security Affairs to President Nixon, would come secretly to Beijing as his emissary to discuss a presidential visit. To prepare for that, a concise version of the chairman's conversation with Snow was distributed in May 1971 through inner channels in China to every CPC party branch and conveyed to all its members. In discussions during that secret visit and an interim visit by Dr. Kissinger in October 1971, as well as a visit by Brigadier General Alexander Haig in January 1972, the two sides candidly explained to each other the positions of each with regard to international and bilateral issues. There were many disagreements, some of them very sharp, but at the same time, common ground was found. For me, interpreting during these preliminary visits was an invaluable opportunity to learn about the issues discussed and the way each side presented its views, including the language used. A crucial issue was the joint communique to be issued at the end of the presidential visit. During Dr. Kissinger's interim visit in October 1971, the American side presented a draft that they thought would be appropriate. Dr. Kissinger, in his White House years, later described it as following the conventional style, highlighting fuzzy areas of agreement and obscuring differences with platitudinous generalizations. In this case, it clearly implied more common ground than actually existed. Premier Zhou Enlai made it clear that such an approach was unacceptable. After consideration, the Chinese side produced a draft of a completely different format. It first laid out the different views of each side on international issues. China's views written out, U.S. views left for the American side to fill in. Then the common views of both sides. It went on in the same manner with regard to bilateral issues. This was probably never seen before in the history of joint communiques. However, it truthfully depicted the positions of both sides at that time, and therefore gave it credibility. As it was with all the American high-level visits, Premier Zhou Enlai met with Chairman Mao Zedong almost every day during the visits. President Nixon's 1972 visit to China began on February the 21st. The highlight of the visit was no doubt the meeting between Chairman Mao and President Nixon. In the Memoirs of Richard Nixon, the author quoted from his diary that Secretary William Rogers, and I quote, had expressed concerns that we ought to have a meeting very soon and that we couldn't be in a position of my seeing him in a way that put him above me, like walking up the stairs or his standing at the top of the stairs. Actually, he was invited to meet the chairman at his residence just after President Nixon had arrived and had finished lunch. He noted in his diary that night that we were escorted into a room that was not elaborate, filled with books and papers. Several of the books were open to various pages on the coffee table next to where he was sitting. The meeting was expected to be an event of around 15 to 20 minutes due to the condition of the chairman's health at that time. But in fact, it lasted for more than an hour. It had been reported in the foreign press that on the way to China, President Nixon had mentioned to the press the day before he arrived that his discussions with the Chinese leaders would be philosophical rather than concentrated on immediate issues. That report had been translated into Chinese and caught the attention of the chairman. At the beginning of their meeting, he picked up that point and smilingly noted that President Nixon had created a problem by confining their discussions to philosophical issues, which produced a round of laughter among those present. The conversation itself was certainly not embroiled in bickering over minor issues, but was rather one between leaders of two great countries who had vision and took the long view, with the big picture in mind. Although each side knew that they had vast differences and a history of mutual animosity, they had come together for an earnest exchange of views on the strategic level so as to seek common ground and a better future. Such sentiments were publicly declared in the toasts at the welcoming banquet that evening. Premier Zhou Enlai said, "The social systems of China and the United States are fundamentally different, and there exist great differences between the Chinese government and the United States government. However, these differences should not hinder China and the United States from establishing normal state relations on the basis of the 5 principles of mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. Still less should they lead to war. We hope that through a frank exchange of views between our two sides, to gain a clearer notion of our differences and make efforts to find common ground, a new start can be made in the relations between our two countries." President Nixon responded that we have at times in the past been enemies. We have great differences today. What brings us together is that we have common interests which transcend those differences. As we discuss our differences, neither of us will compromise our principles. But while we cannot close the gulf between us, we can try to bridge it so that we may be able to talk across it. This, I believe, is the basic spirit of the Shanghai Communique, and it owes much to the strategic thinking, political foresight, and the art of diplomacy manifested by the statesmen of yonder days in both our countries. May this invaluable experience help our two sides to better tackle the difficulties and challenges that we face in the relations between our two countries today, and guide our relations to move together towards a better future.